The king would not allow them to have Bible societies. He vetoed their missionary societies. He demanded an established church. They didn't get to pick where they want. And founders said, that's why we're separated.
Let me make sure I understand what you're trying to say. Basically, American history was accounted for correctly for about 100 years.
Actually, longer than that, because you take the first histories we have in America, they start back in the 1630s of Plymouth Plantation. And from 1630 till about 1900, about 270 years, we just told history the way it happened, which meant there was a lot of religious and moral and governmental aspects that were not economic.
Right.
So 270 years, we taught a full scope of American history. We started about 1900 moving away from that. 1920s, we started teaching a very secular view, and since the 1960s, we've only taught an economic view of history. And that cuts out 95% of what happens in history.
Great historians understand that how we view our history determines the decisions we make in the present and ultimately decides the course of our future. But what happens when we forget the truths of our history? And what are the consequences when we do? Rediscover the astonishing story of our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
Back in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, a new group of historical writers began writing textbooks in America. They included Charles and Mary Beard, W.E. Woodward, Fairfax Downey, and many other writers. Apparently believing that the only thing that mattered in life was money, they began to teach American history with that emphasis, and they introduced what is now called the economic approach to American history, authoring books like this, The Economic Basis of Politics. They also presented the economic basis of the Constitution, the economic basis of the Revolution, and in other words, economics was the basis. And since the economic clause in the Declaration was taxation without representation, this is the one clause we've learned about in our history books for the past half-century. And now, after 2 generations of having been taught that economics is the only thing that matters, our behavior seems to conform to that teaching. For example, 45% of evangelical Christians who voted in recent elections said that economic issues were more important than moral issues. And now we even judge our national leaders not on the basis of their moral character or other leadership traits, but rather on the basis of how the economy is doing, what the unemployment rate is, or how the Dow Jones Industrial Average is performing. Yet if you read American history textbooks prior to these recent writers, in fact, if you just read the 27 reasons given in the Declaration for why we separated, you'll find a completely different view of history from that which is taught today. You'll find that issues other than economics motivated most individuals.
You mentioned that there was 27 separate reasons that the signers basically wanted the Constitution. What are some of the top 3 if 17 was, you know, basically taxation without representation?
And what we don't get is that you have 11 of those clauses deal with abuse of governmental powers. Right. So they were really against, and it was abuse of representative powers. You had the government, the British government coming in, our legislatures would pass laws, and the British government say, oh, we don't want that. Great example was we passed a number of anti-slavery laws as British colonies. The British government vetoed every one of them. We passed a number of religious liberty laws. The British government vetoed them. So we called that an abuse of representative powers. We believed in the consent of the governed. We believed in the will of the majority, and Great Britain kept setting that aside. We had 7 clauses that dealt with military abuses. One of the problems we had is that the military was not run by civilians, it was run by military independent of civilians. So in America, our commander-in-chief is a civilian. We make sure that the civilians are over the military. Yet there are 4 clauses in the Declaration that deal with judicial abuses. The founders said, hey, we're tired of being part of a government where the judges make policy. We're going to start our own nation where judges don't make policy. We never hear that judicial activism was an issue in the Declaration of Independence. You also have moral issues. 2 clauses deal with King George won't let us end slavery. We want to end slavery. We're going to start our own nation where we can end slavery. Religious liberties was another big issue in the Declaration, but all we hear is taxation without representation. This is from 1762, and it is the charter for the very first missionary society in America, the Society to Propagate the Gospel among Indians and others in North America. America thought it was a great idea. But King George III apparently thought that it would compete with the work of the nationally established church, so he vetoed the charter. This type of action by the king did not sit well with a number of the founders who wanted religious liberty in America, including the ability to start missionary societies, Bible societies, or Sunday school societies. Consequently, founding fathers like Charles Carroll of Carrollton and Samuel Adams, who became signers of the Declaration, said that religious freedom was the reason they became involved in the American Revolution. And then there was the issue of slavery. In 1774, Pennsylvania had passed a law abolishing slavery, and other colonies were also making attempts to end slavery, but King George III vetoed those American anti-slavery laws. The king was pro-slavery, the British Empire practiced slavery, and as long as we were part of the British Empire, we would also practice slavery. This position by the king was a source of great discontent for many founders. Henry Lawrence, a president of Congress during the American Revolution, protested against this British position. Lawrence proclaimed,
"I abhor slavery, but I was born in a country where slavery had been established by British kings and parliaments ages before my existence."
Since the only way for America to end slavery was to separate from Great Britain, many founders decided that separation would be an appropriate course of action. In fact, when Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, he personally penned the clause declaring,
King George III has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. Determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold, he has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain this execrable commerce.
that is, not only has King George III engaged in slavery and the slave trade, but he has even opposed all efforts to stop it. Ending slavery was so important to so many of the founders that when America did separate from Great Britain in 1776, several states began to abolish slavery, including Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Vermont, New Hampshire, New York, and others.
So somebody along the line just decided that America should really remember its past and remember its history through the almighty dollar.
Right.
Is basically what happened.
Because that was all that was of importance to those writers. Those particular writers, all they cared, they didn't care about God, they didn't care about religion, morality. What they cared about was economics and gain. And so since that's what they cared about, that's what they wrote about. And you'll find that with most writers, they write about the things they care about.
Right.
Well, what happened was we allowed them to be really the writers of textbooks for a number of decades. And so what happens in historical circles is you start repeating what other historians are saying.
Right.
And you pick up their paradigm, and that becomes what the whole universe of historians in that field say, and you forget what your history was. And that's really what they
Why
did.
do you think they chose the economic? Was that really a prevalent thing, and that changed the way that we actually can, our children's reading of history is affected by someone's choice that history should be viewed through the dollar?
Absolutely. It has affected that. It still affects that today. If you look at textbooks today, we still teach economic issues as the basis of what happens. For example, when we teach the colonization and the first colonists that came to America in the Virginia colony, if you will look at current textbooks right now, they say that the Virginia colony was founded to search for gold. Well, if you read the charter of the Virginia colony, that is listed down there about issue 22 or 24 or 26. Way up top was the propagation of the gospel. But since we're going to talk about the economic view, we're going to take this issue way down here in the 20s and elevate it to the #1 issue.
Wow.
And so when you look at the colonization aspects that we have in America today, we say that all the colonists came here looking for land, looking for wealth, looking to get away from economic poverty they had in Great Britain or France or Holland or wherever. That's nonsense. Every single charter for American colonization puts the propagation of the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's a huge thing, but you'll never hear that in a textbook today. That's why it's so important to go back and look at the original documents and not somebody's spin on the original documents. And that's what textbooks do, is spin that writer's view.